Hello, I'm Suzanne Malveaux, and this is the Washington Week Extra, where we pick up online where we left off on the broadcast. One of the more unusual moments during President Trump's extraordinary news conference this week was when he asked a reporter if she would arrange for him to meet with the Congressional Black Caucus. Here's that exchange.
Are you going to include the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic
Well, I would.
Caucus,
I tell you what. Do you want to set up the meeting? Do you want to set up the meeting?
No.
Are they friends of yours?
I'm just a reporter.
No, set up the meeting.
I know some of them, but I'm sure
Let's go. Set up a
now.
meeting. I would love to meet with the Black Caucus. I think it's great, the Congressional Black Caucus. I think it's great.
Alexis, let's start off with you here. All of us know April Ryan. She's been covering the White House for many, many years. It was a rather bizarre moment in that press conference, and there are a number of questions. Well, first of all, the CBC came out and said, look, we gave you this letter. We've reached out to you. We haven't heard anything back. They tweeted him as such. And we've also heard from Congressman Cummings, who said, look, you know, I'm ready for this meeting, but they're waiting for the Trump officials, the administration, to make a move. Why do you suppose he did this? What was that about?
Well, one of the things that he started off talking about was her question, and her question was about urban policy. And this is a theme that the president's been hitting, talking about Chicago. And remember, April is a radio reporter for American Urban Radio Network, so her question made a lot of sense for her audience. Sure. And but he pivoted, tried to get out of that question about his urban policy by just using the same kind of rhetoric that he's used. And then she followed up by asking, part of her question was, would he utilize the expertise of the Congressional Black Caucus? And at first she said CBC, and we weren't actually sure that he understood what she was saying. And then she added Congressional Black Caucus. But what was so strange about it was, why would he even imagine in his brain that a reporter who happens to be African American would set up an appointment with the Congressional Black Caucus as if they're all in league together? It was a very odd thing, and it was perceived as being both sexist in terms of gender and also really strange in terms of the racial connotation, and his sort of argumentative way with her. And to April's great credit, and she's a friend of mine, I've worked with her a long time, she did what all reporters do. She stuck to her guns, and she tried to explain her question and get an answer out of him and not make it about herself.
And the Congressional Black Caucus, I heard from several members who were insulted because they felt, first of all, that it was disrespectful, but also they felt like they weren't being taken seriously, that this is an organization that has existed for some 40 years. They go back and they've met presidents since Richard Nixon. So to be treated in this manner, kind of in an offhand way, was something that they did not take lightly.
They didn't, and there has been an effort to meet together, but there are factions inside of the White House and inside of the President Trump's world that believe that the caucuses should be disbanded. Their belief is that it's a little too PC, right? Why would these groups segregate themselves? And they've talked about that publicly. And I don't know whether the president has that same belief that somehow the Congressional Hispanic Caucus or the Congressional Black Caucus are not useful to Congress, but he didn't seem to express an interest in understanding until she was kind of moving him along, and then he was very dismissive.
Do you think that makes it more difficult for outreach when they actually do have to talk to different communities, and that's the job?
Well, the irony is the president he has hired people to work for him whose sole job is to reach out to these particular communities. And when I say communities, they're talking about tribal communities, they're talking about women, they're talking about children, they're talking about, obviously, African-American voters. The president is understanding that he has a very low approval among Latinos, and that a lot of his policies are perceived as anti-Latino. And I think you've pointed out, Ed, that the word they use is aliens, right? Yeah. Which is a very derisive term. So the president should not be unsensitive to this, and it was very odd.
Dan, let's talk about the role of the vice president here, because when you looked at what happened with Admiral Mike Flynn and the fact that he was not truthful to the FBI about his conversations with the Russian ambassador regarding sanctions. He was not truthful with the vice president, and President Trump knew and allowed him to go out in public and to say that these untruths, to speak these untruths unbeknownst to him. What does that say about Pence's role and how he is regarded by the president?
You know, it's a very important question, and one that I and others have been trying to get an answer to this week. On the one hand, it appears that they do have a pretty free-flowing and trusting relationship. The vice president is involved in lots of meetings. Their staffs are integrated. He has, as all modern vice presidents have, had a weekly lunch or private meeting with the president, one-on-one. All of that suggests he is in the mold of all of the modern vice presidents. But this is so strange. The White House, he's misled by General Flynn. He goes out on national television, he, the vice president, and backs up General Flynn in what turns out not to be correct. The White House is told that Flynn had in fact talked about the sanctions in this call with the Russian ambassador, and they don't tell Pence that they were informed by the Justice Department that this had happened. The vice president learned that Flynn had lied to him from a story in the Washington Post on the night of February 9th. And that was the first anything registered on him that he'd been hung out to dry by General Flynn. He went to General Flynn to try to get some explanation on Friday morning. Through the weekend, of course, you know, the president was down in Mar-a-Lago and things were kind of swirling. On Monday, it all came to a head. The first indication we got on the night of the resignation was that the president had been somewhat reluctant, had kind of hoped that they could play it out a little longer. The next day, Sean Spicer, the press secretary, went out to the briefing room and said what happened was the president lost trust in him and therefore he had to resign. The president went out the next day and gave Flynn praise. Now, I was told Flynn was very unhappy with what Spicer had said at the briefing and had conveyed that to people, so maybe that was why the president said what he did. And then at the press conference, he was back on the same page with Sean Spicer. The vice president landed Friday night in Germany for a weekend of the Munich Security Conference, and then he's going on to Brussels. He arrives there with this question over his head. To what extent is he in the loop? To what extent are they really sharing all information with him? Those around him say he's in good standing. They're not even worried about this.
But Dan, he's also the person who really is carrying a lot of the water when it comes to dealing with members of Congress. He is the one who is really comforting them, letting them know that, look, there's a steady ship here. There's someone who understands and will go ahead and convey the policy wishes of the president, but also the policy wishes of Congress to the president, that liaison, if you will. Has that role been weakened? I'm
not sure that has been at this point. Senator McConnell, the majority leader, was asked about this today. He described Pence as indispensable. I think for congressional Republicans, they still believe he is the go-to person. He is the one person who understands them. He can convey messages back to the president. So I think that relationship is still solid. But to some extent, you know, it depends on how he's treated by the president. So if there are more episodes like this, this was a big one, I think. But if there are smaller ones, there will be a problem.
Ed, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, McConnell is correct in saying that the vice president's indispensable. I've had a few different Republican lawmakers this week suggest as much, that you know, there are very few avenues into the White House, and he is one of them. And he has spent, in the first 4 weeks, he's up there at least twice a week in meetings with both House and Senate lawmakers. He's a regular presence now when Senate Republicans have lunch on Tuesdays, which is their big sort of planning lunch of the week. He's going to be there every Tuesday, they say, and they want him there because it's a chance for them to sort of convey to the White House through him what it is they want to do, and for him potentially to bring back information from the White House. But one wonders, if he's spending so much time at the Capitol, is that because there's nothing for him to do at the West Wing?
You know, I think there's one other aspect to this, and that is that it's beyond what happened with Vice President Pence, but in so many ways, congressional Republicans kind of want to look the other way about the Russia aspect and some of those questions because they want the president's backing on all their legislative things. And so they want to compartmentalize. So Vice President Pence is crucial to their agenda and to getting the president on board with that. And they want the other stuff to kind of go away. And
while the vice president was headed off overseas, you had FBI Director Comey there on the Hill meeting with senators. And clearly, because there's so many investigations that are unfolding. What do we know about what he was able to convey, and where does that go?
We don't know much at all. In fact, it wasn't even an officially announced meeting. It just so happened that reporters spotted him coming into the building and figured out that he had about a 2-hour meeting this afternoon, Friday afternoon, with members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, which of course is investigating Russian interference in the election. The FBI director clearly had a role to play during the election. He weighed in a few times in ways that many believe affected the race in one way or another. And of course, it was the FBI that's been investigating whatever Russia has been doing. So senators emerging from that, based on the reporting of colleagues who were there, I wasn't in the hallways, but they said, look, senators came out and didn't say anything. Except, I'll read this to you, Marco Rubio in a tweet, I am now very confident Senate Intel Committee I serve on will conduct thorough bipartisan investigation of Putin interference and influence. That suggests he heard something behind closed doors this afternoon that he liked. And it's a signal that Republicans increasingly are taking this much more seriously. When this was first proposed, it was proposed by Democrats and John McCain and Lindsey Graham. Well, most days of the week, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and a few Democrats are in agreement on just about everything, so it's not news up there. But when the rest of the Intelligence Committee has to have an ad hoc meeting on the floor of the Senate the morning after Mike Flynn resigns because they suddenly realize the severity of the situation and the need to dive into this in a much more serious way, and then have the FBI director show up by the end of the week, it shows you they're starting to take it very seriously.
Can I just add, one of the things about the Vice President is that the desire of the Justice Department and the persuasion of FBI Director to come and brief the White House was in part to protect the Vice President, which was an interesting element of this. So when you ask, is the Vice President in good standing with Congress, I think their understanding is in some ways there was another arm of the government trying to protect him, that he had been left out of the loop and allowed to go on TV, and that there was a desire to come and brief the White House about what had happened. So it makes the whole question even more inexplicable about why the president left that gap.
Well, it was also that, and also to stop any potential blackmail, because now you had publicly the vice president saying they didn't talk about sanctions, Flynn and the ambassador, and in fact they did, and that public discourse seemed to open an opportunity for blackmail, which I think was an additional reason that you had Justice Department officials and law enforcement officials going forward to the White House and saying, we might have a problem here.
There were other tests, too, of Trump this week, and people saw various things, and they've interpreted different ways, whether or not it was the North Korea missile test, whether or not it was Iran, and then this Russian spy vessel that was very close off the East Coast. Some people saw that, and we saw that actually in the press conference when they talked about that, and he said,
not good,
not good, not good, not good, 3 of them. What was that about? Was that a real provocation?
Well, the fascinating thing is because there's so much ambiguity about Trump's relationship with Russia, that any sort of military action is sort of being seen in a way that maybe wouldn't have been seen just a few months ago. The missile test that you talk about, that started 2.5 years ago, and yet some interpret that as a test of Trump. The provocation or the harassment in the Black Sea, again, that happens all the time, seen though by some as a test of Trump. And then this vessel about 30 miles offshore, it's an intelligence vessel that sort of basically spies on a submarine base in Connecticut, and it goes to Norfolk, and it's been there several times in the past. It was there in '98, in 2012, 2014, 2015. This is according to the Pentagon, again seen as a test of Trump. And I think because there's so much questions about the U.S. relationship with Russia and Trump's desire to change it, people are seeing this as tests rather than sort of things that have happened militarily in the past. And it's made it harder, frankly, for the Pentagon to talk about this, because suddenly military actions are being looked at in a political light, and their answers could be interpreted as a political response, when in fact, from their perspective, it's not a provocation or a test of Trump, but sort of the normal back and forth that happens between the U.S. and Russia, things that they've seen in the past. So it was very interesting this week to try to see the Pentagon try to maneuver in this sort of political waters now when we talk about Russian actions vis-a-vis the United States military.
And did you understand Trump's explanation during his press conference when he was talking about now Putin cannot be aggressive or he cannot be friendly because of the relationship with the media, or because there's the suggestion of coziness, that now Putin has to be aggressive in some way?
No, I was perplexed by two things. Well, one, that he didn't say, look, this is not a test of my presidency. There were ways to argue it. And two, when he says there's no way to make a deal, you have the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, and we're told the Vice President tomorrow coming out and saying we don't want to work with Russia unless they step up to the plate. So they're not talking about negotiating or making a deal, and it's not because of what Putin wants to do. It's because that what they see is a Russia that hasn't proven itself as a reliable partner. So there's what Trump's saying, and the key members of his national security team are telling their NATO partners publicly, and that's what makes it so confusing. This idea that Putin is the deciding factor. It seems that there's a real division within the administration about how to approach Russia, more than a Russia that's closed off because of the public criticism of the President of the United States.
All right, it's only been 4 weeks. Good luck. Thank you all very much for your insights. Really appreciate it. That's it for this edition of Washington Week Extra. While you're online, check out a Washington Week behind-the-scenes love story that's 50 years old. I'm Suzanne Malveaux. Till next time, have a great weekend.